Hey everyone, Ryan the Vintage Viking here, and I have a kind of a different video than I've done before in the past today. I want to do kind of an author spotlight on today on Thomas Disch. Thomas Disch is one of my favorite authors, one of my most enjoyable authors to read, one of the most interesting authors to me because of the scope of all the different things that he wrote. And so I just want to kind of go over him, give you a little more insight into his career and everything, and maybe that'll spur you on to wanting to read more Thomas Disch. So let's jump into it. All right, so Thomas Disch is who we're going to be talking about today. Sometimes you'll see his name written as Thomas M. Disch. Middle name was Michael. Thomas Disch was born in 1940 in Des Moines, Iowa. He was born into a family that just didn't have a lot of money, wasn't really well off. So Disch went to Catholic school most of his life. His mom homeschooled him for a little bit, but he went to Catholic school in his elementary years and high school years. And you can see that come up in a lot of his writings, his negative view towards the Catholic Church. And it's kind of evident in a lot of what he does. When Disch was in his teens, his family moved to Minnesota to be with his grandparents, and he attended some public school and then also continued in Catholic school. In school is where he started to find his love for science fiction and poetry and those types of things. He was also into drama, but he had stated before that poetry was his stepping stone into the literary world, into writing. That was what got him started in his love and desire to write, was poetry. Actually, one of his teachers had assigned had an assignment to memorize 100 lines of poetry, and he ended up memorizing 1,000 lines of poetry. So obviously it was something that really he desired and was passionate about. So Thomas Disch graduated in 1957, and after he did, he saved up money and did a bunch of different works to be able to move to New York. He ended up moving to New York at the age of 17, and so right around the same time he graduated, and he moved to Manhattan. He ended up working in a lot of plays, dramas, things like that, being an extra here or doing different things there, to be able to get into that kind of scene, I guess you'd say. Disch had a lot of difficulties and struggled a lot with depression and mental things, and even at an early age of 18 he tried to kill himself. It was something that he wrestled with a lot. He stated that at one point he tried to kill himself via gas oven, and but couldn't because he hadn't paid the gas bill or something along those lines, and it was unable to. After trying to do that, he decided to enlist in the military, which was a very bad choice for him. It ended up putting him in a mental hospital, and just wasn't a good choice for someone struggling at that point. So after his time in the mental hospital and the little bit of military time, he went back to New York and was able to work at a bookstore as well as a copyright. He bounced around from different things, working at a theater and things like that, and eventually went back to school to try to be an architect, or wanted to be an architect. That didn't work, and eventually he landed on a school where he could take night classes, and started working on courses having to do with writing. And that's where he started writing novellas and short stories. In 1962, he decided to write a short story instead of doing his midterms. The story was called The Double Timer, and he sold that story for $112 to a magazine. And after selling that story to the magazine, he didn't return back to going to school. He just started taking kind of different jobs, things like that. Ended up working as a bank teller, working at a mortuary, things like that. And all of these different types of jobs allowed him to pursue what he wanted to do. And he'd work during the day, and then in the evening he'd write. And it was becoming something that he was passionate about and wanted to do over pursuing anything else. So he started writing more short stories, he started writing more poetry, he started publishing more, and was able to get a little bit of his foot in the door, so to speak. So Disch started getting really into writing science fiction, especially some of the darker side of science fiction, some of the, you know, more dreary type of writing that wasn't a space adventure to, you know, some other planet. Or so he wrote his first novel, and this is the first major published novel that he had, The Genocides. This was the first one that he had written. After he had written this one, both Brian Aldiss and Michael Moorcock both really kind of picked it and singled it out as like an amazing story, and that kind of got him a little bit of a push, or a little bit of recognition. He also then wrote later on his novel Camp Concentration, which got a lot of praise as well, or a lot of hype or focus on that novel, and that was one of his other major recognizable or well-known novels that were out there. He wrote several short stories and novellas. He wrote under a pseudonym of a woman's name. He published some Gothic works, Gothic horror type works. He did criticisms, he did plays, he did essays, he did, like I said, children's books earlier. He wrote The Brave Little Toaster, which is just a loved classic. And Brave Little Toaster 2, Brave Little Toaster Goes to Mars. After that, he moved from the science fiction kind of genre in the 80s, he moved kind of into a horror element, and there's a 4-part series set in Minneapolis that he wrote as like all together, called The Businessman, The MD, The Priest, and The Sub. And I know several people have read some of those out of order, so I don't know if they're like really linked where you have to read them in order, but that's what I intend to do. I want to read them in order. So I actually just recently picked up the first one, because that was the one I was missing, so I could start it now. So the first one here is The Businessman, Tale of Terror. The second I found a while ago at a thrift store, and this is the MD. And I think on most all of his books, Stephen King writes some sort of synopsis about him, being a phenomenal writer. Then we have The Priest. So here's what Stephen King said. The MD is simply one of the best novels of horror fantasy I've ever read. Thomas Disch has been writing wonderful tales of imagination for years now. Stories that sometimes amuse, sometimes sting, sometimes horrify, and sometimes manage to do all three at the same time. But the MD is surely his magnum opus. That was not just a little blurb from Stephen King that's vague, like, this is the best writer we've seen in years, or something like that. You know how some of those are. It's supposed to be very excellent. And the fourth one, called The Sub, I actually don't have, so I'm gonna get it at some point here, hopefully, and I want to read through those. So I don't know if I will enjoy all of them, but I'm gonna start with The Businessman and see what happens. So he also used to write for like the New York Times and things like that. He's also done a lot of editing on different books. So Disch was an admirer and was a friend of Philip K. Dick. But in 1972, apparently, was very well known at the time, Philip K. Dick actually wrote a letter to the FBI stating that there was coded messages within Disch's book Camp Concentration, and he stated that these were some sort of covert organization that Disch was a part of. So Thomas Disch lived like I said, in Manhattan with his partner for I think like 30 years or something like that. Disch was an openly gay man. He stated in an interview that even though he said, I am gay, but I'm not I don't write gay literature, he said. So it wasn't something that he talked about in interviews and things like that a lot. It wasn't like a forced, pushed type aggressiveness when it came to that. Unfortunately, in 2005, his partner died, and this caused Disch to go into a pretty deep depression. He wrote a few things in between that time after his partner's death. Sadly, in 2008, Disch took his own life, and shot himself. A lot having to do with his depression that he was in and difficulties in dealing with that. He has had quite a huge impact on the world of literature and poetry and everything else, science fiction, horror, all that. Throughout his life and writing career, though, Disch was so profound. He won the Hugo Award. He won Best Nonfiction Award. He had 2 other Hugo nominations. He had 9 Nebula nominations. He had one John Campbell Award. I honestly don't hear a ton about Thomas Disch anymore. I'm sure if we were back in the 80s, 70s, 80s, it would be more prevalent, but nowadays I don't hear people talking too much about Disch and his writing, and I think it's sad because he has just impacted the genre of science fiction so much and been just a huge influence on so many different authors, and is just a phenomenal writer. So I think it's something that hopefully people will desire to read more and to look into more and study up on his life a little more, or what have you, whatever you want to do to kind of rekindle that love for Thomas Disch. So I hope that kind of gives you a little more insight into who he was, his writing. I kind of want to do this for a few authors if it's helpful. I got a lot of the resources mainly from like Wikipedia and things like that, and then kind of going down the rabbit trail of different stuff to find out more information. Obviously there's a lot more that you could spend reading about his life and things like that and have some more insight into, but that's kind of a nutshell, I guess you'd say. And hopefully kind of encourages you to read something of his. I would suggest reading The Genocides. It's his first major novel, his first published novel, and it's excellent. I read it earlier on this year, and it is worth the read. It is a little twisted, a little a little bit leaning into the horror side of science fiction, the darker side of science fiction, but it's still a science fiction novel that you can read and enjoy. And it's one of those books that I find myself having it be like a benchmark for other books when I'm thinking about, how does this book match up or compare to The Genocides? And it's funny because when I read it, I enjoyed it. I was really, captivated by the book and was happy to keep reading it and finish it. I read it pretty fast, and really enjoyed it. But as it's gone on, it's stuck with me more and more and more and more and more, and it's kind of neat how some books do that. I read Kathy Koja's The Cipher, and I enjoyed it after I read it, and I was kind of, there was a little bit weirder writing style for me, so it was kind of hard to wrap my head around at first and get through, and once I got into it, I really liked it, and there was some elements of it that I didn't love, but that's another one that's just kind of lasted and keeps being a standard that I set other books against. And so this is one of those. Genocides was one of those. His short stories are great. I'm reading Camp Concentration next, so that's one of his other major ones. 334. There's a book called here, I'll show you. There's this, which will be easier to find if you want to get Genocides. Genocides is hard to find. This the one that I have, the individual one, is a little harder to find. If you want to just read it, there's this hardcover book that you can find fairly easy, and it has a reprint of these books, and it's called Triplicity by Thomas Disch, and it has 3 major novels in it. So Echo Round His Bones, The Genocides, and Puppies of Terra. So that's an easy way to find Genocides and get a hold of it and be able to read it. I don't know if it's out there in audiobook anywhere. It might be. But other than that, I think finding an original copy of it's going to be a little bit pricey on eBay or things like that. So this is a good way. Triplicity is actually fairly cheap on eBay. I think $15-20 for 3 stories of his. So that's not too bad. Appreciate you guys. If you like these kind of author overviews, spotlights, whatever, let me know so I can keep doing things like that. I'd love to do all kinds of different ones because I like researching about the person and learning about them. It helps me enjoy their writing more when I know, knowing that he struggled with depression, knowing that he struggled with religion, knowing that he had a rough home life when he was younger. Things like that helped me to understand some of his writing more, and makes me a little more empathetic or sympathetic to certain things in his writing, and less criticizing or things like that too. So I'm gonna throw up some more pictures, some covers, book covers that you can see, take a look at, so you can be on the look for, as well as some interviews from Disch, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Xray by Tom Disch. Z is the zenith from which we decline, while Y is your yelp as you're twisting your spine. X is for Christmas, the alternative is an X-ray that gives you just 1 year to live. So 3 cheers for Santa, and onward to W. W's worry, but don't let it trouble you. W easily might have been worse. V unavoidably has to be verse. U is uncertainty. T is a trial, at which every objection is met with denial. S is a sentence of guilty as charged. R is a Russian whose nose is enlarged by inveterate drinking, while Q is the quiet that falls on a neighborhood after a riot. P is a pauper with nary a hope of lining his pockets or learning to cope. O is an organ transplanted in vain, while N is the number of enemies slain. 3,373. If no one else wants it, could M be for me? No, M is reserved for a mad millionaire, and L is his likewise, and goes to his heir. K is a kick in the seat of your pants, and J is the jury, whose gross ignorance guaranteed the debacle referred to above. I's the inevitability of continued inflation and runaway crime. So draw out your savings and have a good time. H is your heart at the moment it breaks, and G is the guile it initially takes to pretend to believe that it someday will heal. F is the strange fascination we feel for whatever's evil. Yes, evil is E, and D is our dread at the sight of a C, which is corpse, as you've surely foreseen. B is bone. A could be anything. A is unknown.